that it follows on the back of the conflict in the poker scene, which quite clearly even YouTube were unhappy with. So the conflict in the poker scene, I think what we get a glimpse of in the poker scene is this hugely heated kind of raw animal magnetism that defines the sort of sexual interaction between characters in New Orleans. And what we see is this kind of Blanche's idiosyncrasy in this surrounding. She is like a fish out of water in this primitive context, in this extremely heated, deeply passionate, kind of impulsive method of interacting with people. And what we then see in scene 4 is the kind of aftermath of this, and Stella and Blanche trying to kind of digest the significance of this. And the key kind of idea in this scene, I think, is the fact that Stella is completely undisturbed and unperturbed by what happened at the poker scene. For her, it's just an element of everyday normality. But for Blanche, it's a complete disaster and she reacts with what Stella calls kind of hysterical over emotion to this. But I think a normal human being would be somewhere between the two of them. Maybe we wouldn't necessarily be hysterical like Blanche, but I don't think we would be as unperturbed and as comfortable as Stella is in this scenario. So the question that we want to focus on is how's the conflict between Blanche and Stella developed in terms of their survival and adaptation. And that's ultimately what we see in this scene is Stella is the one that adapts. She's the one that is capable of just shifting the nature of her being so that it's comfortable in this new reality. And Blanche, as we see in this scene, is completely at odds with this and is unable to do so. So this is the kind of aftermath scene that I'm sure you will experience. Well, I'm sure you've experienced already, but you'll experience it a great deal more when you go to university. This is the post-booze up disaster here. So it's early the following morning, and there is a confusion of streetcar cries like a choral chant. And again, the sound in Streetcar is extremely expressive. And so we have this kind of the confusion of street cries again signifies, I think, the penetration of the external circumstances into the internal domain of the apartment. But it functions, I think, almost like a Greek chorus in tragedy. The Greek chorus is that sort of externalization of the kind of significance of what's going on in the play and offers a running commentary on those moments. And I think sound in Streetcar almost functions like a chorus. It offers us this constant commentary of the state of affairs, particularly of the protagonist. And so this confused street cries, Williams deliberately makes that point clear when he says it's like a choral chant. He's invoking Greek tragedy there. And I think it reveals the state of conflicts that's been established between the two orders of living here. Blanche's sense of idiosyncratic chivalry, and then Stella and her adaptation to this kind of rugged, materialistic primitivism that we're seeing, I think, defines the way that the characters interact in this text. Stella, though, is lying down in her bedroom.
Sound imagery?
Yeah, well, you could most certainly call it auditory imagery, but in terms of the key thing to bear in mind in this paper is you have to use the theatrical terminology. So you would have to say the way that sound is used, but also the stage directions that create the sound. You can then say within them that there's auditory imagery, but particularly with Streetcar, because the stagecraft is so poetic in Streetcar, whereas in Pinter it's not. It has a sort of abstract meaning, but it's not poetic and lyrical like Williams. There's a lot of poetic language that's used within the stagecraft in Streetcar. So she's lying down in her bedroom and her face is serene, so she seems completely tranquil in these opening stage directions. And there's a sort of a re-established animalistic pattern of behaviour that we're seeing the sort of aftermath of, there's a giant fight, there's this huge sense of conflict, and then, everything goes back to normal. And that's ultimately what the structure of the play recreates as well. The structure of the play recreates that sort of return to a primitivistic status quo. But importantly, she's sort of resting her hand on her belly. And I think that gives us this sort of animalistic connotation of survival and adaptation and procreation in this moment. We see this sort of image of her maternal body being presented at this moment, I think, of great intense conflict, and they're being animalized. They're being presented as impulsive, and they're being presented as sort of savage. There's this kind of post-coital, after sex sort of destruction that's going on in their apartment. And Blanche sort of explicitly talks about this. This will probably get this video banned from YouTube as well, but hey, I didn't put it in the play, it's in there. Tennessee Williams put it in there. She rounds slightly with new maternity, and from the other dangles a book of coloured comics. Her eyes and lips have that almost narcotized tranquility that is in the face of Eastern idols. So there's a sense of her being at peace, so much so that she seems almost kind of drugged by sexual passion here, or the aftermath of sexual passion. So she seems at that point in time in this opening stage direction to be almost sort of off her head. She's kind of, it looks as if she's been taking kind of heroin or something similar, that she's so at peace with herself and so kind of distanced from the disaster and the conflict that surrounds her, because of that intensive physical passion that I think ultimately dictates that the characters will keep coming together, and they will keep coming together in a way that is like collisions, and that's where I think the thunderstorms come out in this play, is that characters are determined by their physical passion. It's the streetcar named Desire that inevitably brings them together. And so there's a sort of aesthetic contrast between this and a birthday party. We think of the birthday party, really what's inevitable in the birthday party is our own alienation from each other and our distance from each other. In this play, it's the opposite, in the sense of we're determined to constantly be brought together in these conflicted states of sexual passion that are akin to a kind of dramatic thunderstorm in their violent outpourings. We are doomed to constantly have these kind of collisions with each other. And we think of that vocabulary describing kind of sexual interaction as a collision, I think captures the aesthetic of the play and why we keep seeing these sort of cycles of violence and then the restoration of tranquility. It's I think a fatalistic vision of quite violent sexuality, and I think that is where it shares an enormous amount with Desire Under the Elms for you HL guys. There is that sense of fatalism that's driven by desire in both plays that I think makes them very consistent with each other. So there's this scene, the table is sloppy with breakfast and the debris of the preceding night. It's very deliberately sort of chaotic and almost kind of post-feeding. It looks like a kind of, you can imagine this sort of as a savannah scene with bits of carcasses and things. There's been a kind of glut and an indulgence and a sort of passionate engagement, and then we have the kind of violent aftermath, and that's where Stella seems most at peace here, and her appearance is entirely contrast with Stella's. So this is where we see that Blanche is the one that is worrying on Stella's behalf, and Stella doesn't really care. This is completely normal for her, this sense of conflict. But Blanche is all over the place psychologically. She presses her knuckles nervously to her lips as she looks through the door before entering. So she is the embodiment of the conflict with this kind of physical and virulent reality. She is the one that's at odds with this dramatic, rugged reality that we see in New Orleans. She's the one who can't handle it. Stella is fine with it. She's made her peace with it. But what we see in this scene, I think, is the way that it's still a conscious effort for Stella. She isn't sort of numb to the effect of this reality. She is constantly having to try and convince herself that actually it's okay to be that way, because it's a survival of the fittest kind of text. This text is ultimately about survival, and Blanche doesn't. Blanche kind of is sort of adapted out of the evolution in this text, and Stella is the one that manages to survive through a conscious decision in the end, deciding that she has to not believe Blanche's story because it allows her to carry on. So Stella, Blanche is going, Stella, she's all nervous, and then Stella, stirring lazily, says, and she's kind of inarticulate here in her comfort. And this moment in time, she's so comfortable that she's actually lost the ability to speak, and I think that's an interesting contrast with a birthday party. Stanley loses his articulacy when he is least at ease with his surroundings, when he's entirely robbed of his identity and individuality. Blanche utters a moaning cry and runs into the bedroom, throwing herself down beside Stella in a rush of hysterical tenderness. So there's a sense of this sort of excessive feeling, this excessive sensibility that she uses to respond to this moment of conflict in the play that is completely absent from Stella. So her sort of heightened sensibility, her sort of Southern Belle sensibility, is completely at odds with the reality of this industrial city and the dynamics of quite violent sexual passion that we see unfold here. And obviously part of the tragedy is the play that she ends up, without really necessarily meaning to be, folded into that conflicting dynamic of violent sexual interaction. Blanche says, baby, my baby sister. So there's this sort of sense of her attempt to establish a connection between the two of them and an invocation of the past, a desire to establish a connection between the two of them on the basis of their shared heritage and their shared history. And Stella draws away from her, and I think she, at this moment in time, sees Blanche as a bit kind of incomprehensible. Because Stella is at peace with this established order, this order of cyclical kind of dramatic passion, violence and conflict, and then tranquility being re-established. Passion and desire in these plays moves in cycles, and Stella is completely at ease with this, or at least is forcefully making sure that she stays at ease with this. Blanche straightens up slowly and stands beside the bed, looking down at her sister with the knuckles pressed to her lips. There's this kind of very obvious, expressive, physical demonstration of her fear and her alienation from Stella at this moment in time. She's fearful for Stella, but she's also, I think, fearful for the distance between the two of them, that she is kind of at odds with these surroundings and can't really make sense of them properly. Over the page, they then have a dialogue, where Blanche is meaning to be talking about something severe, and Stella simply talks about it as if it's, he's popped out to the shop for some milk. Will he be back? He's gone to get the car greased. Why? So she sees this as a completely mundane incident. She doesn't reflect on the previous night as some sort of reason for dramatic change. And that shows, I think, her ability to adapt to this quite violent new reality. And then Blanche sort of explains her sort of hysterical approach here, and Stella just says, she says at the end, I started to run in after you, and Stella just says, well, I'm glad you didn't, so the difference between the two of them is quite evident there. And Blanche just says, what were you thinking of? And Stella makes an indefinite gesture. Answer me, what? And so the contrast in reaction shows, I think, the difference in their adaptation to this reality, that actually Stella doesn't really have a good answer to this. So there is an element of truth in what Blanche is saying. She is being hysterical, but she is also at the same time expecting some form of rationale from Stella for adhering to the relationship. Why are you in a relationship with a man that violently beats you? This doesn't make sense. But what we see through the play is that ultimately, it's that order of relations and what it metaphorically says about society that William sees, I think, as triumphant, and that is what makes it quite a bleak text, I think, in many ways, is this sense of a violent social order being the thing that ultimately defeats this sort of weak sensibility of a character like Blanche. And so Blanche calms down a little and says, I will repeat the question quietly now. How could you have come back in this place last night? Why? You must have slept with him. So there's a kind of element of hypocrisy here in Blanche's accusations. Her immediate resort is to think about sexuality. Of course you had sex with him. If his pajamas are strewn all over the apartment, then of course, not only did he violently beat you, but then your resolution of this was through the act of sexuality. And I think there is an important element of hypocrisy here, because Blanche very frequently, as we will find out as we go through the play, resorts to sexuality as a way of dealing with her own sense of internal conflict. Yeah, her past at Laurel and her past with the younger men. She's got a real passion for young maybe guys your own age actually. She's very keen on sort of late teenagers, we would call them. Easy. We don't want this one blacklisted by YouTube. So you'll see what follows in the next scene is precisely that prototypical example of Blanche's desire getting out of control, and she ends up in that scene kind of kissing that young man who comes to sell her something. Stella gets up in a calm and leisurely way, which again is an example of her tranquility. And she just says, Blanche, I'd forgotten how excitable you are. She almost can't really believe that they're even having the dialogue. She refuses actually to engage with Blanche on an intellectual level here. She doesn't provide a sort of moral and ethical rationale for why she's staying with Stanley. She just accuses Blanche of hysteria and is almost stunned that they're even having the conversation in the first place. Why are we having this conversation, for God's sake? This is just reality. Get used to it, love. And she says, am I? Yes, you are, Blanche. I know it must have seemed how it must have seemed to you. So there's a sort of consciousness of the difference in their perspectives from Stella in these lines, that she's aware at least of how Blanche will have seen this violent activity. I'm sorry it had to happen, but it wasn't anything as serious you seem to take it. In the first place, when men are drinking and playing poker, anything can happen. And I think we read this from this moment in time and I find it quite alarming that, this type of behaviour can be excused on the grounds of just boys being boys, basically. Boys being boys does not mean being violent towards women, I think, and really shouldn't ever have been. But that is, I think, that the resignation in Stella here is that this type of conflicted relationship is inevitable if we succumb to the natural sort of fatalistic forces of desire, that violence is part of the everyday goings on of romantic, passionate relationships. And so that, I think, when she says here it's always a powder keg in this line here, it functions as a metaphor, I think, that shows her resignation and her acceptance of this aggressive behaviour. But it's ultimately her acceptance of this aggressive behaviour that allows her to adapt to a new reality. And so I don't necessarily think from Williams, Williams, I think if he sides with anyone in this play, he sides with Blanche. So I don't think he's praising Stella necessarily for her resignation here and for her refusal to hold their relationship to a higher set of moral standards. But the ultimate vision of this play is that this is the new reality, and everything that it represents, that crude, violent, consumerist materialism that he forecasted would dominate sort of American economic life and social life in the later half of the 20th century, he saw that as winning, and that ultimately the people that adapted to that reality fastest were the ones that ended up surviving and thriving. And it's not necessarily to say that he thinks that that's a good thing, but at the same time, he empathizes, I think, with Stella's effort to try and survive. There's characters that are trapped between rocks and hard places in this text, I think.
And also at the end, even though Blanche is kind of resisting this tragic reality, which is good in some way, she ends up the worst out of all of them. So that could be another metaphor.
Absolutely. The fate of the people that choose not to embrace this new social order, so to speak, is not a positive one. They are driven mad, and I think there's something sort of metaphorical of the artistic position in Blanche's fate. Someone who refuses to engage in society in the fashion that they see as orthodoxy is the one that ends up being destroyed in the end. And that's exactly the same fate that Stanley has in The Birthday Party. He is the one that ultimately refuses to adapt to a type of orthodoxy, and because of that is destroyed by those forces. So their fates in both of these plays have very similar kind of narrative arcs, the protagonists. They're these aestheticized and aestheticizing individuals that, because they see reality clearly, can't abide by its norms, and because of that are then dominated by those forces that they feel themselves alienated from. And that's ultimately the tragedy of both of them, I think. Anything can happen, it's always a powder keg. He didn't know what he was doing. Again, this is kind of hollow excuses, I think, for his behaviour. He wasn't aware of what he's doing, and there's a truth in it. It is impulsive, sort of subconscious behaviour to an extent, but we use that language, I think, and I use that language to make sense of it, not from a moralistic perspective of excusing violence towards women. I think it's part of the aesthetic of the play that most of the characters are presented in this impulsive fashion. And then we're given the contrast. He was as good as a lamb when I came back. So he's animalistic again, and it again gives us this sense of his behaviour being beyond his control. But it is only when Stella returns and adheres to his dominance that submissive quality in his personality comes out at this moment in time. And he was so very, very ashamed of himself. And I think the fact that she is aware of this is a reflection of her own sense of trauma. The fact that he was so very ashamed of himself, and yet she seems to treat the behaviour quite lightly, I think, tells us that she is on some level aware of the severity of his violence against her and the problematic nature of his character. And that makes it all right. And Blanche, I think this is where we sympathise with, or I certainly feel like I sympathise with Blanche the most at this moment in time, when she's trying to get Stella to hold Stanley to account for his violence and his amoralism, his viewing of their relationship without a moralistic lens. It's through this kind of primitive Darwinian lens of just the natural order of things that their relationship is described. And Stella just says, well, no, it isn't all right for anybody to make such a terrible row, but people do sometimes. And a sense of acceptance there is portrayed, I think, purely from a social perspective, that I've made noise for other people, and therefore what I've done is wrong. In the same way that it would, according to that category, them just having a kind of shouting match at each other would be just as bad, which it of course isn't. It's nowhere near as, I think, sort of repugnant from a moralistic perspective to be just shouting at each other, even if what you're shouting is extremely offensive, than to actually physically abuse someone. I think that they're categorically different. Stanley's always smashed things. There's a sense here, I think, of a natural order in his kind of violent behaviour. He's always been this way, and therefore somehow it's okay. Just because there is an eternal sense of fatalistic violence, that doesn't necessarily excuse it from a moral perspective, but it is what Williams, I think, reveals to us is triumphant in this new vision of conflicted social relations. And this, I think, disturbs Blanche a great deal. On their wedding night, he snatched off one of my slippers and rushed about the place, smashing the light bulbs with it. And there's an awful lot of activity around the light in the play. And we think of Blanche kind of surrounding the light with her paper lantern, and then this is Stanley's approach to it, smashing it violently. And you can see the difference in their characters, but through this motif of dealing with the way that the light that's shed on reality. And so I think there's a sort of irony about this in that both of them, both Blanche and Stanley there, are trying in some way to get rid of this light. Blanche is trying to mask it with this sort of ornamental, aestheticized paper shade. But Stanley just destroys the light bulb so that there is no reality. And so both of them, I think, are critiqued by Williams through this motif of the way that they handle the light bulbs, the way they react to these light bulbs. Ironically shows that they have a sort of shared resistance, I think, to reality itself in some way. Stanley's vision of reality is limited as well, even though we call it realistic. I think that tells us more about actually how right Williams was in predicting that way of viewing the world would be seen as triumphant. Realism we associate with honesty, and Stanley's realism is extremely limited. He fails to have a kind of moralistic and aesthetic understanding of the world, and for someone like Williams, that's an extreme problem, and for someone like me also.
Isn't that comparable to the way that Goldberg destroys Stanley's glasses?
Absolutely. That the way that they handle his vision is precisely, I think, what Stanley attempts to do to Blanche. He attempts to shatter her methodology of seeing the world, both in a literal sense and in an ideology. In terms of ideology, he completely attempts to violently destroy that way of seeing the world. And then she's stunned by this. She says, "And you let him, didn't you?" Scream. And I think there's a sense here of Blanche being stunned by the violent reality of this, and Stella failing to sort of hold up to those moral standards that I think are metaphorically embodied in handling reality through the lens of an aesthetic, which is what her paper lantern stands for. I'm going to moderate the light of reality, but through the lens of a sort of aesthetic illusion, ultimately, whereas Stanley's attempt is to just destroy it. And so this stuns Blanche, that he would handle reality itself metaphorically in that way, that he would destroy the light of reality, so to speak. So that both of their approaches to this, I think, are as limited as each other. And to be honest, I think Williams would sympathise a lot more with Blanche than Stanley. But this is a real moment of authenticity from Stella. I was sort of thrilled by it. And so she's kind of captivated by this sort of rugged, naked display of power. And this is, I think, where we have an interesting contrast with the birthday party. Those naked displays of physical power that we see in the birthday party, McCann's tearing the strips of paper up, the insistence on Stanley adopting the kind of subordinate position on the stage, are not necessarily something that you would be thrilled by and compelled towards. They're things that you are co-opted and forced into in the birthday party. Whereas Stella here is kind of captivated by it, that display, that sort of alpha male display. He's kind of like a gorilla beating his chest, smashing the light bulbs in the apartment. Stella is thrilled by it. She is enjoying it. And, you find yourself constantly when you're analysing this play making very, what I think would be called misogynistic apologism for masculine behaviour. She loved it anyway. so who cares? You know, well, Stella loved it, so why does it matter? And that, I don't think, is necessarily a particularly effective moral defense of this type of behavior.
Due to sexuality.
Yeah, I think here we're seeing a violent way of understanding reality that actually Stella is compelled towards. She's attracted to it. And so that's why she can't really understand Blanche's hysteria. She's like, well, why wouldn't you like this sort of rutting alpha male behavior? Because it shows us his sort of virulent sexuality. And so this is the conflict. You know, this is a conflict I'm sure many people have had. You know, they're you know, girls talking about their boyfriend, and then one of them saying, well, he's a violent arsehole. Why are you with him? Oh, I just don't know. I just find him so attractive. You know, that conversation is timeless. You know, it's a timeless conversation. And so there is obviously an element of truth to this. And Blanche just says, you're so matter of fact about it. And I think that partly shows, I think, the way that Stella has started to internalize Stanley's way of viewing reality. That Stella is matter of fact about the way she sees things, and I think reveals her gradual change in the surroundings. But Stella's question here, I think, shows us the dilemma that she's in. What other can I be? What else can I do? So here is a pragmatic acceptance, I think, due to their compromised circumstances, that Stella has had to adapt to this reality because there's no alternative. The alternative is what happens to Blanche. And Blanche's resistance to this reality ultimately causes her the destruction of her identity, and at least a figurative death rather than a literal one. So the alternative is to, in some way, subjectively die instead of adapting to this reality. And so she therefore is in a complete sort of, I would say, sort of existential dilemma. I'm either someone who makes their peace with this violent way of seeing the world, or I'm just, you know, going to find myself destroyed in the way that Blanche does. And there's an ironic kind of use of language further down when Blanche says, pull yourself together and face the facts. You know, if ever there was someone that could probably do with that advice, it's her. She is the one that I think has misapplied her own facts and faults, and if anything could be said to characterize her condition of vision, it's the fact that she is unwilling to face the facts so frankly and honestly and communicate them. So I think she's already misapplied her own faults at this moment in the text. And then Stella, I think, is aware of this because she says, well, what are they in your opinion? What are the facts in your opinion? There's a tension between the vocabulary that they use. The Blanche is talking about facts and Stella immediately invokes opinion. In my opinion, you're married to a madman. And so there's a huge difference in their vision here that's, I think, encapsulated in those vocabulary choices, facts and opinion. The Blanche talks of facts as if they are objective, as if they are objective reality, and that, I think, captures her faulty vision.
But does Blanche ever tell Stella that she's raped by Stanley?
Yeah, at the end, she tells her, and Stella chooses not to believe it. And that's part of the reason why, because Stella has to, if she believes it, she knows that she can't go on with her normal life. And that's ultimately, I think, that the part of the play where we see this, the vision of reality that Stanley represents sort of winning. You know, it's triumphant. So, Blanche says, yes, you are, but your fix is worse than mine. So, you know, she acknowledges that Stella is in some way trapped by necessity at this moment in time. Only you're not being sensible about it. And then again, I think that word captures the nuances of that word. Sensible, both in sense of being pragmatic, but also emotional and having a sensibility. The two meanings there, I think, show us the tension between both of their approaches. Stella is the pragmatic one, the one that we would maybe say in some fashion is being sensible, you know, in terms of just pragmatic power relations. She is siding with the powerful. Blanche is not. But in terms of sensibility, having some sense of emotional responsiveness to the situation and then letting that inform your vision of morality, well, Stella is not doing that. Stella is not invoking her own sensibility to adjust her behavior. She is sort of insensible to the violence that she's subjecting herself towards. And so that language, I think, captures the tension between the two of them. And Blanche here is in this sort of mistaken sense of pragmatism. I'm going to do something, get hold of myself and make myself a new life. So there's this rhetoric of sort of action and pragmatism that she uses, but as we come to find out, that doing something with her life is fabricating a story that then creates a role, a passive role for her that is reliant upon this Shep Hutley man. You know, her taking control of her life is lying about who she is and becoming the kind of the arm candy for a millionaire. You know, so her pragmatism is again compromised by her willingness to adopt a passive role in a relationship with a man. And so we then see ourselves, you know, where can women go in this play? What's their way out of this situation? You know, they either adapt to the reality of being treated violently by a man like Stanley, or they have to engineer this artificial reality just in order to adopt another passive role in a relationship with a powerful man in a different way. You know, a man of extensive material power. And so there's no, you know, the escape methods from this difficult sense of conflicted fatalism for women in this play are almost non-existent. And Williams, I think, did deeply sympathise with women at this moment in time.
And do you think he's trying to say that the old way of looking at it, that women aren't supposed to work and supposed to be dependent, is kind of, it makes women even more passive because they're not able to have freedom in their life and choose what they want to do?
I think one of the central acknowledgements in this play is the compromised position that women are in. You know, it's not a coincidence that it's the women that are on the receiving end of the most difficult treatment and the most conflicted behaviour in this play. You know, it's not men that necessarily physically suffer in this play, although it is an element of the conflict. On my YouTube video. Hello. She is here. Yes. Okay. Right. You have to go see Miss Fawley, so I don't know, sign in probably. Not now, but at the end. So, this approach, I think Stella articulates this a little further down. She said, I am not in anything that I have a desire to get out of. You know, so this is not necessarily Stella's experience, if we take her speech at face value, is not of being trapped in a relationship that she can't navigate her way out of, because she is compelled by a deep-seated sexual attraction, I think, to Stanley. She finds him extremely attractive. And that's why they chose Marlon Brando in the original, you know, the movie that's so famous, is that they wanted someone sort of smouldering and with a lot of raw sexual magnetism to capture this sort of doomed aesthetic, that people are doomed to be attracted to people that aren't necessarily good for them. Which is why if you find someone that you are attracted to that is nice, don't let them go anywhere, because they're hard to find. So this desire, I think, is channeled into sort of socially acceptable forms a little further down in the speech. So she here tries to excuse lots of this behavior. Oh, look at the mess of this room and those empty bottles. You know, she tries here to say that his behavior is nothing different to hers. You know, it's his pleasure, like mine is movies and bridge. People have got to tolerate each other's habits, I guess. And so her sort of resignation and acceptance, I think, shows us this sense of adaptation that I think is in contrast with Stanley and the birthday party. Because Stella is the one that moves with and adjusts to orthodoxy and power. You know, Stanley Kowalski in this play represents a new orthodoxy that is in its incipient moments of domination. You know, the materialism that went along with America's huge economic expansion in the aftermath of the Second World War, and that ultimately sealed its position as the global hegemon, you know, the global economic superpower. Stanley, I think, represents that new reality, but it's a violent reality. And that Blanche is the one that can't see how to move with that tide of power. And Stella is the one that anticipates that that's where material power is going, and that she is the sort of pragmatic one by adapting to that new reality. And Blanche shows us this. I don't understand you. I don't understand your indifference. Is this a Chinese philosophy you've cultivated here? She doesn't actually get it. She doesn't understand that that's how power is shifting. And that's important because there's a reason that she falls foul of it later on in the play, because she doesn't grasp the significance. She doesn't get that if she chooses to ignore this reality, she will end up being in conflict with it. And that's one of her, we call it a fatal flaw maybe, you know, her unawareness of the pragmatic nature of reality and the power that goes along with it. And when she says, is this a Chinese philosophy that you've cultivated? It's stoicism. You know, where have you got this stoic indifference to external events? Where have you cultivated this sort of numbness? How have you done that? Because I can't do it. And so there's a huge difference, I think, of understanding between the two sisters here. But again, what you see now is that this is not set in stone yet, and that's where the drama of the conflict between Stanley and Blanche comes from, is that Stella is inclined towards seeing the world the way that Stanley does at the beginning, but it's not fully fixed, and that Blanche represents a threat to that vision. And that's why Stanley, I think, has to dominate and destroy her, is because he can't tolerate the idea that somehow Blanche will disturb that vision of reality that he's sort of inculcated in Stella. And this is what we see here. Something ordinary has happened, and Stella laughs uncertainly, and picks up the broom and twirls it in her hands. That uncertain laughter here is, I think, what gives us a sense of her actually adapting with effort, her effortful adaptation to this reality. She knows that there's something not quite right about what she's doing. She knows that it's compromised and that it's a conscious effort to do so. You know, she knows that there's something wrong going on here, that she shouldn't be abused violently, and that it's a conscious effort to convince herself that it's a necessary sort of succession to the demands of a new reality. She's convincing herself consciously with effort, I think. Now, this is where we see, I think, a switching of the sympathies, where we think, so far, we kind of are inclined to sympathise with Blanche, I think, in this scene. She's the one that's saying to Stella, you need to hold this guy to moral account. Like, what is going on here? This is an unacceptable way to live your life. And yet now what we're given is the reasons why this is not always possible. Blanche says, stop it, let go of that broom, I won't have you cleaning up for him. And then just Stella pragmatically says, well, then who's going to do it? Are you? And then she goes, no, I didn't think so. And so here we have this, I think, shifting of the audience empathy here, is that, yes, Blanche has moral absolutism. She has a sense of moral value, but she doesn't have pragmatism. She's not really willing to adapt to this new reality. I'm not cleaning with a broom. So I think here, she is unwilling to accept the compromised nature of their power, you know, that they have lost their social status and that they have lost Belreth, this beautiful dream that maybe didn't even exist in the first place. And therefore they are now in a compromised position that involves a pragmatic revaluation of what they can afford to be moralistic about, according to the vision of reality that we see through Stella and Stanley. And then she says, oh, let me think, if only my mind would function. We've got to get a hold of some money. That's the way out. And so we see here that it is raw material power that enables Blanche to have the perspective that she has. And so we then start to question, well, is her view on life and her ideology and her aestheticization of reality purely the product of having lived a privileged economic life? Is she able can she afford to have that perspective? Well, I think the answer that this scene seems to be convincing us of in the second half is yes. You know, her previous material power allows for that sort of moralistic understanding of reality.
Couldn't this part also show her hypocrisy for how she used to before criticize Stanley on his vision?
Yeah, I think so. You know, the fact that she invokes this escape methodology that relies upon material wealth, I think shows that we're all kind of constrained by those material realities, even though someone like Blanche would like it to be otherwise. You know, she's the sort of archetypal kind of, you can afford to be moralistic because you're rich. And then your moralism is tainted by your compromised material power and material wealth. And that's what we see here. When we think here of her escape from this fate that Stella exists in, this is not ideal either. We look at her solution. And her solution is basically lying to a millionaire. And she says, she talked about going to see him in Miami during the Christmas holidays. Well, I did. I took the trip as an investment. And now we're starting to see the hypocrisy here. She's invoking a relationship in the terms of materialism. She's invoking, exactly, she's spending money on a relationship with someone else as an investment. She's looking for his material power. And therefore, we kind of think, well, hang on, how comes this hasn't escaped your sort of moral absolutism? How has this investment in a relationship not escaped the lens of moralism that you're applying to someone else in compromised circumstances? And so there's an enormous sense of hypocrisy, I think, in the way that she plans to extricate herself from this compromised situation. And then we start to think to ourselves, well, actually, is this really about your moral vision, or is this simply about socioeconomic superiority? Are you disgusted by this behavior because it's poor people? Or are you disgusted by the behavior from the lens of moral purity? The moral purity, I think, she is able to have when she has the economic means. And so the economic means make possible the moral vision. And I end up standing like Goldberg here, is it the money that's necessary or possible? The money is what makes the morality possible. So the finances are necessary and the morality is possible because of those finances. And so her material power is what enables her moral perspective, I think, here. And we see that through this hypocrisy. She says, I ran into Shep Huntley. I ran into him in Biscayne Boulevard on Christmas Eve about dusk, getting into his car, Cadillac convertible. Must have been a block long. This is not the language of someone who is indifferent to material facts and to economic power. Here, she is fetishizing wealth, I think. She's fetishizing his wealth and shows us that this is not just a values-based sense of freedom that she's invoking here. She is fetishizing his money. And so we therefore think to ourselves, well, this complicates the extent to which we sympathize with her moralism here. Is her moralistic vision an excuse for socioeconomic prejudice? That's, I think, part of what goes on in the scene. And you'll find yourself wanting to sympathise with people, and there's no one who you can fully sympathise with. We look at Stella and we think, hang on, love, this is a bit silly. You're tolerating a violent idiot here. And then Blanche's solution to this is to adopt a passive role and to fabricate a sense of reality in order to be a gold digger. But what we're seeing here is that for women, there's no ideal solution. They can't get their way out of these scenarios because they are curtailed by the social norms that limit their economic freedom and their ability to invent reality for themselves in a way that actually allows for their independence. Stella says, I should think it would have been inconvenient in traffic. And so this sort of contrast between the two of them shows us that pragmatism that she has.
No, nothing like sexual. But like,
where's this going?
It's referring to the Cadillac, but could it be like Blanche's relationship with this guy would be inconvenient in society?
Yeah, it would be cumbersome and probably inauthentic and probably would prevent her actually from adapting to the new reality. She's just buying herself, literally, the opportunity to cling on to her old way of seeing the world and her old social reality. Inconvenient in traffic, dear oh dear. Now, he says down here, you've got oil wells. He has them all over Texas. Texas is literally spouting gold in his pockets. And this language here, you can almost sense the enthusiasm in this sort of... It's actually kind of anthropomorphizing Texas itself in a way that draws this man almost into the point where he owns all of Texas. He's having money poured into his pockets, and that gives us an enormous sense of vital power, I think.
But isn't this part of Blanche like mirroring Stanley previously?
Absolutely. She's fascinated and fetishizes material power here. And it also shows that this, that the raw power of perhaps a slightly different kind in Stanley that Stella is attracted to, Blanche is attracted to just another embodiment of that power, and it's based on just wealth. At least Stella's is something other than just money. It's a sense of rugged, violent power at times, but it's that raw physical embodiment of that same sense of kind of almost like a kind of Nietzschean Superman. This kind of, it's almost like a kind of Nazi Ubermensch. Thank you for that. Yes.
What's the nominalization of horny?
I'm probably not going to formulate that one. I don't know. I've never used it. I think probably the emotional state and nominalization are mutually exclusive. I don't know that people nominalize their language when they're in that condition. Using abstractions in the state of primitive physical attraction, I don't think necessarily is the first thing that springs to mind. But Blanche here, I think, is explicit and is aware of this. You know how indifferent I am to money. I think of money in terms of what it does for you. And there's an enormous amount of self-delusion in this particular line. Yeah, of course. You can't be indifferent to money if you fetishize the size of someone's car. She is obsessed with the length of this guy's car. And I think, just saying it, we can't necessarily escape the kind of the phallic connotations of this. Exactly. It's inconvenient in all the collisions that will go on here. So she here, I think, opposes what she has just moments before revealed, that she's not indifferent to money. She's entirely kind of fascinated by it. And yes, there is a sense of a motivation of needing that material power to extricate herself from a compromised moral situation. But she has to use compromised morality in order to do so. And so neither of them have an opportunity to gain a sense of independence that doesn't involve some form of moral compromise. And so they are trapped in difficult places. So we're not necessarily supposed to hate Blanche here. We're supposed to see her at one with Stella in the fact that they have to compromise their morality in order to try and adapt to a reality that they don't really have any control over themselves. And she says, think of money in terms of what it does for you. And you will always hear, all of my friends that are greedy and like making money will always say, oh, it's freedom, oh, it's this, and oh, it's that. And yeah, there is a certain amount of truth in it. But it's funny that people that supposedly invoke freedom all the time never really talk about that, and they do then talk about all the crap that they've bought with their extensive bank balance. I don't my rich friends, all the ones that work in the financial sector, I don't hear them invoking abstract concepts like freedom. I hear them talking about the car they're going to buy and the watch that they've got and the holiday they went on. So there's this is a very habitual excuse for being greedy. I think of what it does for you, somehow as if it's this fantastic abstract facilitator of your own independent will. And I think, that's a huge part of the economic ideology that governs in both America and now everywhere else in the world, is that money is a facilitator of freedom and independence. And yes, it is, but at the same time, it can be a curse and a limit. It can be something that destroys your independence and your liberty as much as it grants you freedom. So there's the age-old excuse here for being a kind of covetous materialist. He could do it. He could certainly do it. And we think, well, he could do what? He could give her material power that allows her to pretend that she has an absolutist moral perspective. That's what he would be able to buy with his money. You've got 9 minutes left. Just think. The less of it that goes on now, the more of it goes on this back catalogue that's coming for this god-awful piece of homework that you've got coming. You're paying with the credit card. You're paying with your free time credit card, and there's interest. So, here, we'll take a look at this page and then we'll stop. She says, she's asking about being married at this moment in time.
Almeno c'è più knowledge il tuo sembra cosa per asciugarci le mani.
If we don't know about dissing each other's notes.
Good. Like, whoa, Burn, your notes up. I've seen them. She's the note taker queen. At least you have some. We've moved up in the world. We've moved up in the world from last year. Yeah, I know. It's good. You're a minimalist, which is fine. Your book looks like mine. Let's take a look at this last page and then we'll stop. So, Blanche says, honey, would I be here if the man weren't married? Stella laughs a little, and they're talking about this Shep guy and him. I think there's almost sort of a bit of fun that Williams has with the name here. He's Shep and he's going to set up a shop. There's a sort of, I think it's supposed to make it sound a little bit ridiculous.
A sexy shop.
No! God's sake. Blanche suddenly springs up and crosses to the phone, and she speaks shrilly. She's talking like this. She's kind of Western Union operator. Western Union. She's kind of this is meant to deliberately show us how badly equipped she is to be pragmatic and to take charge of her life. Her voice becomes ridiculous in this moment in time. And then Stella says, that's a dial phone, honey. This is not something that you can just shout operator into. She's made to look a fool here. I can't dial. I'm too. Just dial 0. And she said 0. Yes, O for operator. Blanche considers a moment, then she puts the phone down. So I think this shows us how badly equipped she is to carry out this sense of pragmatism. She can't put her life in her own hands because she's been born with a spoon in her mouth and even has a phone that involves not dialing the numbers because she's rich and lazy. So she seems, she's completely a fish out of water here. She cannot. This is her going, right, I'm going to take control of my life. And then she picks the phone up and says, operator! She's completely unable to be pragmatic. She doesn't have the sort of street smarts, we'll call it. She's not hood enough to survive in the ghetto of New Orleans. She's completely at odds. This just says uncertainty with reality. Liz, what are you looking at? This stuff?
Yeah.
Attempts to take power into her hands, but perturbed by reality. She's disturbed by reality. She's unsettled by it. She has no. She has a small little attempt. She gets on the phone and shouts operator into the phone, and then, oh my God, it's too much for me, and then stops. So her fragility is what we ultimately see here.
But is this comparable to any of the female characters in the birthday party?
I think so. I think they're
Like maybe Moon's fragility and how she becomes.
Her fragility in the hands of raw power is an important part of that play. She ends up adopting a passive role because that's all she knows. And Meg as well. Meg is in this sort of trapped in this repetitive passive trap, and I think shares a sense of I think ineffective adaptation to the realities of power that Blanche shows us here. And then a little further down here, she says, she smashes the pencil on the table and springs up. So if we take a look at what she's using here, she's picked up a sheet of Kleenex and an eyebrow pencil for writing equipment. It's not a coincidence that these are the props that Williams chooses to use. That, this is Blanche taking control of reality. She's going to use a napkin and an eyebrow pencil to do so. So we've got the items that she uses to fabricate this sort of elusive perception of herself being used to sort of symbolize this attempt to engage with concrete reality. So these fanciful props and her attempt to create concrete reality and pragmatism are at odds with one another. And she smashes the pencil on the table and springs up. You never get anywhere with direct appeals. She's literally tried for like 2 seconds to do something about it and then collapses in this state of sort of hysterical powerlessness. And I think the props there are important in showing us that she's never going to, she hasn't got, she hasn't got Brianna note-taking abilities. She doesn't have a kind of a file of facts with lots of, labels and important notes in it. If this was Brianna, she would have a huge plan. Exactly.
Blanche is not.
Brianna's pragmatic and powerful in her pragmatism. Blanche is a wig. So that means that you're closer to Blanche than Brianna, which is telling us something about you.
Blanche.
She gets around.
She also, I don't need to know about that particular component of the similarities. Yes, we can. So, let's stop there, because I think that is enough for now. But that does mean that a little couple of extra pages is going on your credit card bill.
Oh my God!
So, brace yourselves for the worst homework of all time. But it's going to be worth it in the end, I promise.
Non sai stare.
Quella è tipo Blanche.
Non sei stare.